Hello and welcome to this month's community call in Brighter Days, Darker Nights. My name is Nico, and I love hosting these calls for all the women in our community to get together. We have a lovely mix of mothers at all different stages, whether expecting or getting ready to conceive their first or having their manyth child. And we also have quite a few practitioners in the community who are here to learn and support the women in their lives. And I think that's also a lot of us moms. We do that. We're constantly learning these things and then passing on the knowledge and picking up new knowledge. And that is just the beautiful circle of how wisdom gets shared. So this class is going to be maybe a bit more experiential, based on some of my my personal experiences, what I've seen working for families. And we will do some of the science stuff as usual, but I'm more going to be referencing some of the other places you could go to learn more about that, because I think for this class it's just going to be fun to talk more about the practical application of all this. I think that's where a lot of the questions land too, like sourcing. How do you source ingredients, and how do you make determinations about which ingredients to get, and what to do when you're working on a budget, and all these kinds of things. So I'm calling this class Nutrition and Cooking for Preconception, Pregnancy, and Postpartum. And I'm making it for mothers and practitioners. Thinking about food, we of course have to eat. And I think we all know that eating and nourishing ourselves is what makes the building blocks for being able to make our own bodies and our babies' bodies. So we think a lot about nutrients and what they're doing and what they're like physically. But I also want to think also about the energetic element. We do think about food as energy, and then that's where we're still kind of in the mainstream there, thinking about the that's what keeps us moving. So part of it we burn for fuel. Then the other element we have as like the information that's coming in food, and we all know this and have experienced this, but it's not always talked about as much, that what you eat for one meal will often influence how you feel and how your body processes the next meal you eat. So some of that information is coming in and giving signal information that carries on down the line. And then the culture piece. So when I did my very first doula training, which was back in 2011, we were taught that the entrance to the nutrition conversation with our clients was best approached through the cultural lens and asking what they are already doing inside of their own homes, inside of their own kitchens, what they learned growing up, and that it's much easier to add nutrition into a conversation about food and how to make maybe some slightly healthier choices within what they're doing than to try to give them any kind of outside objective meal plan saying like, this is what you need to do. If you try to get them to start a whole new program, for one, I don't know, most of you have probably done this. I've certainly done it a number of times, especially when I was younger, diving into a new plan that was supposedly going to fix everything, and instead I ended up either constipated or with the runs for like 2.5 weeks when my body adjusted, or like all kinds of crazy things can happen when you suddenly shift, super dramatic stuff happening emotionally also when you try to change everything all at once. So I nowadays take a much more flexible approach. Early on, I tended towards a more restrictive diet, and that was partially because I think I know that I was raised vegetarian, and that had a lot to do with it, that I was very accustomed and conditioned to asking what was in the food, and in many, many cases rejecting it. And the thing that broke me on that, I probably would have stayed vegetarian forever if I hadn't gone and studied abroad in my late teens, being thrown into a host family situation. And the whole time that I was there, I was strict with my vegetarian, and, my host mom would always tease me about it. She would literally try to sneak meat into my food, and I would just put that part to the side. And After I got home, looking back, I realized like, wow, I was incredibly rude over and over, and I rejected a lot of experiences because I was so close-minded about what healthy food was and what I was allowed and not allowed to eat. And it kind of made me want to open up for the social elements of food. And so that kind of wrapped around once I learned that doula training piece. I was like, oh my gosh, that really could have been a helpful thing to have understood beforehand, that food isn't strictly building blocks and energy, but it's also information and cultural sharing and a social experience. So I think all of that fits very well into understanding the kitchen in the home where we're making all of this food happen, whether that's for ourselves or our clients. Like the energy that we're putting into our food and the energy that we're bringing to the table when we're eating, all of that really matters. So that's kind of my story of how I went from a very restrictive into more of a gratitude-based and more open-minded. So there are still some like super hard no's, and we'll talk into that. Like for me, I still tend to land more in the restrictive part, but it's something that I'm always expanding and trying to stretch my tastes. So when it comes to those specific building blocks and things that we need for pregnancy, being nourished for childbirth and all of the demands on us postpartum, I think about, two of the things that I really like to start this conversation with and that I get so many questions from women about are folate and iron, because these days it seems like pretty much every mom at some point gets told or suggested that she's not eating enough folate, and it's basically impossible to get enough folate in a natural diet without supplementation. And same story with iron. Almost all the moms these days are told that they are anemic. And then again, going down the supplementation path. And there are so many women who then have negatives. So the iron especially tends to have negative side effects, like the most basic one being constipation, but also some other more severe ones. And I've written about those and taught about those recently. So if you aren't familiar with my quantum anemia series, you can go back and do that. Like for this class, I really wanted to get to the practical elements, but just kind of laying the the foundation of how did I come to think that we really need a food class that is the practical elements of it, is that how can we maximize the nutrition that we're getting out of the beautiful alchemy that we're doing inside of our homes every day. So when it comes to the iron and when it comes to the folate, part of the conversation that I think is really missing are the cofactors that are needed for all of those biochemical processes that demand those minerals and those B vitamins. They all are working together. So just adding one single supplement doesn't necessarily address the whole picture of why one or the other of those might be low. So for folate, the cofactors, especially we're looking at DHA, vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, choline, the whole suite of B vitamins, not just folate, and then a handful of amino acids also in there. And without all of those systems working, then just adding the individuals, and we're starting to see this more in the research as they're looking into, how can we support women? Like a lot of women, when they have morning sickness, they're told to supplement B6. And it's not that I'm necessarily opposed to that. It's just I would rather that there's a foundation of a diet that's supporting all of the B vitamins. To be used in combination if you're working with a practitioner who's like testing your blood levels and telling you what you need to take and all of that, to also understand what are you doing that can make that either, make that all go better for yourself. And then also learning how to cook for yourself. You're also going to be cooking for your children. If you work in the postpartum space, like I started out as a postpartum doula, so that involves being in people's homes and helping them out. So like, what are the first meals that you're cooking for a mom after she gives birth, and are they supporting her? Or are they potentially throwing gasoline on, some of the systems that are a little bit fired up after birth that need maybe a little more tender touch? So when it comes to maximizing nutrition from food, there are a few pieces. Like for one, of course, the food itself. Where is the food coming from? And many, many women don't learn how to cook from, their parents. So some do, some are coming in and they're like, oh yeah, my mom cooked from scratch. It was natural for me. I learned to cook from scratch. And we just, for them, that's normal. And for other women, they come into this whole time where they never learned how to cook. It was, they were in school all the time, even a lot of very high performing people who like know how to do all kinds of amazing things. But then when it comes to the kitchen, they don't know about the time and dedication, the recipes, they don't have it just kind of built into their hands because they haven't been doing it since they were young. And then they get kind of thrown to there's like lost information. So how can we replenish that without overwhelming someone? Because again, getting like understanding that cultural baseline of where are you at and what can you add that will make what you're already doing a little bit healthier or more nourishing on any of those levels. For some, it might even be just mindset and gratitude work. For others, it might be like, we really need to learn how to cook more than just macaroni and cheese, or, whatever the thing is, like those staples that people get locked into. So some of the questions that I always get when it comes to that food sourcing thing is that we have, especially if you're spending time online, you're probably hearing about the local seasonal diet. The local seasonal diet is like blah, blah, blah. Like everyone's talking about these days, I think. And that was one of the other concepts that cracked me open from growing up vegetarian and then realizing that living in a temperate winter climate, that actually was bringing in a huge amount of imported food into my life. And that if I wanted to be local, seasonal, that I was going to be fairly malnourished if I didn't also incorporate some animal products. And like I had gone from vegetarian in my childhood to actually being vegan for several years in my late teens and early 20s. And then realizing that that was going to be very difficult for me and that I was having some different health issues that maybe meat would help with, that I was culturally very locked down because of that inhibition, that all kind of has shaped me. And I have now talked with a lot of women who have been in similar states. And so it's not saying that any particular diet can't work, but when it comes to the local seasonal conversation, depending on where you live, it really depends what the exact composition at any day or time. And usually there's an element too of like incremental changes. So I see other people who do a lot more work in the nutrition space than I do. And they'll always say, I'm not going to tell you what I eat in a day because that doesn't say anything about what you should eat in a day. And when I took a class from Lily Nichols a while ago, who's very prominent in the nutrition space for pregnancy and preconception. And she said that in her research, she had seen that carbohydrate content, for example, that's one of the main things that shifts depending on what latitude you live at, what availability of local seasonal carbohydrates are there. So she said, well, it's possible at the equator to have a totally healthy pregnancy on like as high as 30% carbs, whereas in the polar regions, we also were seeing totally healthy pregnancies with as low as 2% carbohydrates. And when you look into the academic research, there's almost no information at all that you can find about ketosis in pregnancy. And that's one of the other things I get a lot of questions from women who have experimented with kind of the opposite end of the restrictive diet that I had put myself on, where I was eating so much, plant-based. And then I have other people now who are coming in who are like in the carnivore side that are like afraid to eat plants, just like I was terrified to eat meat. And they're like, well, am I going to harm my baby if I stay in ketosis? And so like we see that ketones are, if it's done right, it's super healthy. But in the research on it, they can't really tease out between ketosis that's happening from starvation and undernutrition from ketosis in a healthy woman who's eating like actual real foods. And then additionally, one of the other things is there's that like junk keto where some people are doing ketosis, but it's based on super highly processed foods. And so they're essentially eating a processed food diet, but it has the, protein. If you just look at the macros, it sits on the keto side. And there's just so much variation there. So I don't know if this is ringing bells for all of you guys of all the different things where I'm like, there's so many totally different camps out there that it can feel really difficult to have a sense or like a stable sense of ground. And that's where I like that cultural anchor. Like, where did you grow up? what is comfortable for you, what's natural for you, what is going to be a sustainable routine that you can get yourself into. And then from there, like when you look at it, what your ideal would be, like what are just a little baby step that you can move your needle a little bit towards like a little bit more. So some of that would be like, sourcing local foods, what kind of local foods are available, looking at those imported foods. And so I have gone back and forth. I've tried to do like an entirely local diet. And that was when I was especially still more in the vegetarian, and it was really, really difficult where I live. In some places it wouldn't be as difficult. Nowadays it's getting easier. I think to find farmers markets and CSAs and like network with people. And I think part of that also is I was moving a lot more at that time. So when you're moving, it's harder to build relationships. Whereas when you live in one area for many years, it's really easier to get a referral to a local farm. And then, having a relationship with one farm tends to lead to a relationship with another farm. And, next thing you know, like you go from being able to pick up some eggs to like, now we have some milk to now we have like a, produce box or, all different kinds of ways that happens. That's the networking. And that again ties back into that food is relational. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit was like thinking about those imported foods, some of the qualifiers for me are, looking back historically, humans have always had trade routes and we always want to taste something new. That is something that I think is a built-in desire for exotic foods that is part of wanting to like maximize our nutrient profile. I remember being totally amazed when I learned that our hair actually holds isotopes of the food and water that we eat. So they can actually do radioisotoping, which is like, that's the number of neutrons inside of the nucleus of a cell. Not a cell, an atom. So the amount of neutrons doesn't change the composition of the atom. So it's still like the same hydrogen or whatever, but it has an extra neutron or extra many. And so those are called isotopes, and they're different all around the world. So they could actually test people's hair and tell where in the world they had been or traveled to based on the isotopes that were in their hair. So like at this subatomic quantum level, we're being built from the food that we eat and the places that we inhabit and the water that we are, drinking and bathing in, all of that stuff. So for foreign foods, I really think about the preservation process and like how that food is transported. And so for that reason, I tend to prefer dehydrated foods because I'm thinking like a dehydrated food is something that naturally has a longer stable shelf life for those longer transit times. And I also think about, nowadays we have that flash freezing, and there's been, like I was on a call with one of my colleagues, Sarah Pugh, recently, and she was saying that flash frozen fish has an extremely like similar profile. And we all know the difference though between like fish that's never been frozen when you cook it and eat it compared with fish that has been frozen. It's much easier to get a tender cook and way easier to overcook it and make it rubbery when it's been frozen. So things like that, like fermentation, we all kind of have heard of like, pickled foods being one of the things like that those transport better. And like a lot of the canned foods and things like that to me is a little bit more modern technology. So I'm a little bit more wary of that. Also, like the linings of the cans are maybe a concern for different factors. And, like it's always this kind of back and forth for me where we're like, what is the total ideal? What is going to make me feel good, like happy culture wise and like proud to serve food on my table? And then also the affordability question, what is the pricing? And that's where, as my family has grown, I have gone more and more towards super bulk pricing, which has led me to simplifying the diet so that I have more of like a consistent things that we're eating on a regular basis, because then I can buy them in bulk and get a lower price per pound. And when I started doing that, that was also a huge community builder for me, because again, it deepens the relationship with whoever your provider for that is. If you're having to make special orders and showing up and you're getting these like big downloads of food, and it feels kind of more like, I don't know, like Little House on the Prairie or something, where you like go to town every 2 weeks and get this big, huge import. And it's so exciting for all the children when this huge amount of food comes into the house and like, woohoo! And all of the work of having to put it away. It's nothing like having the amount of work that goes into it if you're farming for your family and for larger families. But that bulk food element is another thing that also commits you to, well, now we have all this food and we have to cook it. We have to cook it. And so you don't run out of food as often. You have to plan ahead a little bit more, but you're, maybe a little bit less likely to then go and spend the food budget on other items that aren't in what your intended plan for the upcoming time is.